What would you do if the world labeled you as discarded, as if your life had already lost its value? On a frozen morning in 1878, a woman stood alone at a crossroads with nothing but a worn-out trunk and a shattered past. But what if that very moment wasn't the end, but the beginning of something powerful, something that could change not only her fate, but the lives of everyone around her? Stay with me, because this story isn't just about survival. It's about dignity, courage, and the quiet strength that refuses to be broken. If you believe in stories that heal and inspire, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to support the journey.
October of 1878. The wind didn't just blow through Mora County, it cut. Maggie Calloway stood in the hard-packed dirt of the Kessler Ranch yard. Beside her sat a battered leather trunk. It held everything she owned in the world, which wasn't much. It was dawn. The sun hadn't quite cleared the ridge. The frost on the ground crunched beneath her worn leather boots. Frank Kessler didn't even have the spine to face her himself. He sent his foreman, a thick-necked man named Higgins. Higgins stepped off the porch and tossed a small leather pouch of coins. It hit the dirt at Maggie's feet. "Boss says here's 2 weeks' wages," Higgins said. His voice was flat, rote. "We don't waste wagon space on returned women. You can walk to the stagecoach depot." Maggie didn't cry. That was the frightening part. She had simply run out of tears. She bent down, picking up the pouch. $5. That was the going rate for her pride. She looked up at Higgins. She didn't yell, she didn't beg. She simply spoke, her voice clear and carrying through the cold morning air. "You tell Mr. Kessler something for me, Higgins. A woman is not a parcel from a Sears catalog. We are not goods to be ordered, tested, and discarded the moment we refuse to surrender our virtue or our voice. God gave every woman a soul and a right to her own bodily dignity. No man's wealth gives him the right to treat a human being like rented property." Higgins spat in the dirt, turning his back. "Just start walking, lady." And so she walked. 2 miles to the crossroads. She dragged the heavy trunk behind her. Her hands blistered. Her shoulders ached. But she kept moving. Because in 1878, a divorced woman standing alone on a territorial road was a woman meant to fade away. The law said she couldn't own land without a husband. Society said she couldn't have honor without one. Her ex-husband had gambled away her home, and now 2 ranchers had looked at her, found her lacking, and cast her out. She reached the crossroads. The dirt met the main trail. She sat on her trunk. Her breathing was ragged. She was waiting for the Albuquerque stagecoach. She was going to spend her last $5, ride into the city, and disappear. She was finally ready to give up. Then she heard it, the slow, rhythmic creak of wagon wheels. It wasn't the stagecoach. It was a weathered buckboard wagon pulled by 2 steady workhorses. The man holding the reins wore a faded Stetson. His jaw was square. His eyes were the color of slate. He didn't look at her with pity. He didn't look at her with hunger. He just looked. He pulled back on the reins. The wagon rolled to a halt. Eli Harmon sat there for a moment. He looked down at the mud-splattered woman. Then his eyes dropped to the small paper tag tied to the handle of her trunk. Monsieur Calloway. Eli knew that name. 3 months ago, a letter had arrived at his ranch. It was a response to his advertisement for a housekeeper. It had been delayed in the post. By the time he read it, he figured she was long gone. He didn't ask her why she was covered in dust. He didn't ask why she was sitting alone at a crossroads at dawn. Eli wrapped the reins around the brake lever. He stepped down from the wagon. His boots hit the dirt with a heavy thud. He walked past her, gripped the leather handles of her trunk, and hoisted it effortlessly into the back of his wagon. Maggie stood up, her hands trembling. "Sir, I appreciate the gesture, but I am waiting for the stagecoach to Albuquerque. I've been turned away twice this month. I won't waste your time. I know how men see me now. I am damaged freight." Eli stopped. He turned around. He didn't offer a polite smile. He looked her dead in the eye, and his voice was as steady as bedrock. "Listen to me, Mrs. Calloway. There is no such thing as damaged freight when it comes to human beings. A person's worth does not drop just because some fool was too blind or too cruel to see it. We are all born with equal value, and no amount of hardship strips you of your right to be treated with respect. Now, keep your head up. Step into the wagon. He walked over and opened the wooden side door of the buckboard. He didn't know her history. She didn't know his grief, but he held the door before she ever had to knock. The ride to Harmon Creek took 2 hours. The wagon bumped over rutted dirt. The wind howled off the eastern ridges. Maggie sat on the hard wooden bench. She held her shawl tight against her chest. Eli didn't make small talk. He didn't ask her for a smile to pass the time. He just drove the team. His hands were steady on the leather reins. They crossed a shallow creek. The horses pulled them up a rise. Then the ranch came into view. It wasn't a grand estate. It was a working man's home. Weathered pine boards, a wide front porch, a massive barn sitting out back, its red paint peeling from the sun. It looked tired. It looked real. Eli pulled the wagon around back. He tied off the horses. He lifted her heavy trunk out of the wagon bed like it was full of feathers. "Through the kitchen door, Mrs. Calloway," he said. Maggie stepped inside. It was warm. The smell of old wood smoke and dried herbs hung in the air. The kitchen was clean, but it lacked a woman's touch. No curtains. Just bare windows facing the scrubland. A large cast-iron stove dominated the far wall. A heavy oak table sat in the center. Eli set her trunk down by the pantry. He walked to the stove, stirred the coals, and tossed in a fresh log. He set a tin coffee pot over the heat. "Sit," he said. He pulled out a chair. Maggie sat. She kept her spine straight. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was bracing herself. She had done this twice before. She knew the drill. The rancher would look her up and down. He would list his demands. He would tell her what she wasn't allowed to do. Eli didn't do that. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a leather-bound ledger and a pencil. He sat across from her. "I run 80 head of cattle," Eli said. "I grow hay. It's just me, my son Coul, and an older hand named Roberto who lives down the road. We work sunup to sundown." He looked at her. His gray eyes were calm. "I need a housekeeper. The pay is $10 a month. Room and board included. You have your own room off the back of the house. It locks from the inside." He paused. "Does that suit you?" Maggie looked at the ledger. Then she looked at the man. She thought about Kessler, who had expected her to warm his bed. She thought about Pruitt, who had called her a useless old hen when she refused to cook his meat rare. She took a breath. The air filled her lungs. She found her voice. It was steady. It was absolute. "I need you to understand this, Mr. Harmon. I am selling my labor. I will cook your meals. I will scrub your floors. I will mend your shirts. But I am not selling my dignity. I am not a parcel for men to test out and return when I don't suit their temper. A woman's worth is not determined by a man's convenience. If you keep me here, you keep me as an equal human being. You will speak to me with respect, or I will pack that trunk myself." She waited for the anger. She waited for the dismissal. Eli didn't blink. He took his pencil. He flipped to a blank page in the ledger. He wrote something down. Then he pushed the book across the table. He had written, "M. Calloway, $10, equal respect." He looked up. "That isn't a demand, Mrs. Calloway. That is a God-given right. Every person who draws breath deserves to be treated with honor. You will find no master in this house, only a man who needs help and a woman willing to give it. We have a deal." Just then, the back door slammed open. A boy walked in. He was tall, maybe 17. He had Eli's broad shoulders, but his face was sharp with anger. He stopped when he saw Maggie. He looked at her trunk. He looked at her. "Another one?" The boy's voice was sharp, bitter. "Pruitt fired her, Kessler threw her out, and now she's here. Are we running a charity for cast-offs, Pa?" "Coul," Eli's voice was low. It held a warning. "Take your hat off in the house and mind your manners." Coul ignored him. He glared at Maggie. "My mother used to run this kitchen. You aren't her. Don't think you are." He turned and stomped down the hall. A door slammed shut. Silence fell over the kitchen. The coffee began to boil. Maggie didn't flinch. She had taught school for 19 years. She knew the difference between a bad seed and a broken heart. That boy's heart was broken. Eli rubbed the back of his neck. He lost his mother 6 years ago. He hasn't found his way right since. I apologize for his words. Don't apologize for his grief, Mr. Harmon, Maggie said softly. I'll fetch my trunk. Eli showed her to the back room. It was small, a narrow iron bed, a washstand, a small window looking out at the grazing pasture. On the nightstand sat a small dried wildflower in a glass bottle. Someone had left it there a long time ago. Maggie unpacked. She laid out her 2 spare dresses. She set her hairbrush on the washstand. That night, she sat on the edge of the bed. She pulled out her small leather journal. She opened the inkwell. She dipped her pen. She wrote one line, Day 1. I am still here, and I am treated like a person. The frontier did not care if you were tired. The frontier did not care if your heart was heavy. The sun came up and the work began. Maggie woke at 4 in the morning. The floorboards were like ice. She dressed quickly in the dark. She tied a thick canvas apron over her skirt. The first week was brutal. She had to learn the temper of the old cast-iron stove. She hauled water from the pump outside, her fingers going numb against the iron handle. She boiled laundry in a massive copper kettle over an open fire in the yard. She stirred heavy, wet wool with a wooden paddle until her shoulders screamed. By the 5th day, her hands were raw. Blisters formed on her palms. They broke and new ones formed. She didn't complain. She didn't slow down. She had a roof. She had a locked door. She had her pride. Eli watched her. He didn't hover. He didn't offer pity. Pity was cheap. But he noticed. On Tuesday of the 2nd week, Maggie went to sweep the front porch. The old barn broom was heavy. The handle was thick, made for a man's grip. It splintered her skin. When she woke on Wednesday, the broom was leaning against the kitchen door. The handle had been shaved down. It was sanded smooth. It fit her hands perfectly. She looked out the window. Eli was already out by the corral, breaking a young horse. That evening, she was washing the supper dishes. Her knuckles were bleeding slightly from the harsh lye soap. She dried her hands on her apron and went to her room. Sitting on her washstand was a small tin. She opened it. It was sheep's tallow, infused with dried lavender, a remedy for cracked skin. Eli was sitting by the hearth when she walked back into the parlor. He was oiling his saddle. Thank you, she said. She held up the tin. You didn't have to do that. Eli didn't look up from his work. He rubbed the oil into the leather in slow, steady circles. Labor has dignity, Mrs. Calloway, but no one should be worked to the bone without care. A society that values the sweat of a worker more than the health of their body is a society that has lost its way. We protect the people who build this world. It's that simple. Maggie stood there for a moment. She let the words wash over her. It had been nearly 20 years since a man had worried about her well-being. Things began to shift. Slowly. Even Coul started to thaw. Just a fraction. It happened over dinner. Maggie had made a beef stew. It was a cheap cut of meat, but she had simmered it for hours. She had gone out to the wild scrub and found fresh cilantro and wild onions. Coul sat at the table. He ate his first bowl in silence. He got up to get a second. He stopped by the stove. He didn't look at her. The broth is good, he muttered. It tastes like something. It's cilantro, Coul, Maggie said quietly. It cuts the fat of the beef. Coul nodded once. He sat back down. He ate. He didn't yell. It was a bridge, a very small bridge built on wild onions. 2 days later, the sky turned a bruised purple. A sudden, violent autumn storm rolled in over the ridge. The wind tore across the valley, carrying sheets of freezing rain. Maggie was in the kitchen. She saw through the window that a massive canvas tarp over the winter hay was blowing loose. Eli and Roberto were miles away fixing a fence line. Maggie threw her shawl over her head. She ran out into the storm. The wind nearly knocked her down. The rain was like needles. She grabbed the heavy ropes whipping in the wind. The canvas was heavy, heavy as a dead weight. She pulled. Her boots slid in the mud. She wrapped the rough rope around her forearms, biting her lip against the pain. and tied it to the wooden stakes. She was soaked to the bone, shivering uncontrollably. Suddenly, Eli rode into the yard. His horse was breathing hard. He jumped down. He saw the secured tarp. He saw Maggie standing in the mud, drenched, holding the frayed end of the rope. He didn't yell at her for being out in the storm. He walked over, took his thick oilskin duster off his own shoulders, and wrapped it around her. "Inside," he said. That night the storm passed. The air was sharply cold, clean, and still. Maggie sat on the front porch. She had a mug of hot tea. She was wrapped in a dry wool blanket. The front door opened. Eli stepped out. He carried his own mug of coffee. He sat down on the wooden bench next to her. He didn't ask if he could. It just felt natural. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sound was the drip of rainwater from the eaves. Eli looked out into the darkness. "You work harder than any hand I've ever hired," he said. His voice was a low rumble. "You don't quit and you don't complain." He took a sip of his coffee. "If you ever want to talk about what Kessler and Pruitt did to you, I will listen." Maggie gripped her mug. Her chest tightened. The shame of being discarded was a heavy cloak. She had worn it so long it felt like her own skin. She whispered. "I don't want to talk about them." She braced herself. She expected him to press. Men always pressed. They always felt entitled to a woman's secrets. Eli simply nodded. He set his mug on the railing. "Then we won't. A person's past belongs to them alone, Maggie. You don't owe me your trauma as payment for your room and board. The right to privacy, the right to heal in your own time is sacred. You share what you want, when you want. Until then, the past stays outside this gate." He used her given name, Maggie. He stood up. "Good night, Maggie." "Good night, Eli," she said. She watched him walk back into the house. The door clicked shut. Maggie took a deep breath of the cold night air. The stars were coming out, piercing through the leftover storm clouds. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was breathing. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt safe. November brought a hard freeze. The ground turned to iron, the grass cracked underfoot. It was the first Tuesday of the month, supply day. Eli hitched the wagon early. He didn't ask Maggie to go. He simply waited by the team. She wrapped her heavy wool shawl tight and climbed up beside him. The ride to Cielo Rojo took 2 hours. Cielo Rojo wasn't much of a town. A single dirt street, false front buildings, a saloon, a mercantile, a telegraph office, and the Grange Hall. Today the town was crowded. Wagons lined the street. Horses stood tied to hitching posts, breath pluming in the cold air. "Whole Valley is here," Eli said. His voice was grim. He pulled back the reins and set the brake. "Why?" Maggie asked. "A meeting. Eastern money is in town. A man making offers." Eli didn't sound hopeful. He sounded tired. They walked to the Grange Hall. It was a large, drafty wooden building. Inside, the air was thick. It smelled of damp wool, stale tobacco, and desperation. Dozens of ranchers and farmers sat on hard wooden benches. These were men with dirt under their nails. Men who fought the earth for every penny. Maggie stood near the back, near the wood stove. Eli stood beside her. He took off his hat. Then the man at the front spoke. He didn't look like New Mexico, he looked like Philadelphia. He wore a tailored gray suit, a silk vest, a heavy gold watch chain draped across his stomach. His boots were polished leather, untouched by mud. "Gentlemen," the man said. His voice was smooth, like oiled glass. "My name is Warren Pruitt." Maggie stiffened. Pruitt. The name hit her like a stone. Dale Pruitt was the first rancher who had cast her out. This man had the same sharp nose, the same cold eyes. But where Dale was a crude bully, Warren was something worse. He was a smiling predator. "I know it's been a hard year," Warren continued. "The drought this summer nearly broke you. The winter is coming on strong. The banks are calling in your notes. I represent a syndicate from back east. We aren't here to take your ranches. We are here to offer relief." A murmur went through the crowd. Relief was a powerful word to a starving man. Warren held up a sheaf of papers. "We are offering immediate cash payouts, up front. Clear your debts, feed your families. In exchange, you simply sign over the unused water rights on your property, just the water. You keep your land. You keep your homes. You keep your cattle." A few men leaned forward. They looked hungry. They looked ready. Maggie watched Warren's face. She had spent 19 years married to a crooked lawyer. She knew a snake oil pitch. She knew that in the West, land without water was just dirt. The meeting broke up. Men lined up at the front to look at the papers. Eli didn't move. His jaw was tight. The muscle in his cheek twitched. Harmon Creek was drowning in debt. The medical bills from Bee's final year had piled up. The bank in Santa Fe was threatening foreclosure. Warren Pruitt's cash was a lifeline. Warren saw Eli. The Easterner stepped away from the crowd. He walked straight toward the back of the hall. He stopped in front of Eli. He didn't look at Maggie. To him, she was just the hired help. Invisible. "Eli Harmon," Warren said. He held out a soft, manicured hand. Eli didn't take it. "Pruitt." Warren let his hand drop. He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "I heard about your troubles with the Santa Fe Bank. It's a shame. A good man like you carrying the weight of a sick wife's debts. A terrible tragedy, her passing. The bank won't wait much longer, Eli. Sign the water lease. Save your home." Eli looked at the paper Warren held out. It was crisp, white. It looked like salvation. Eli didn't take it. "I'll read it over. Send it to my ranch." "Don't wait too long," Warren said softly. He turned and walked away. Eli put his hat back on. He turned to the door. "Let's load the supplies. We have a long ride back." The ride home was quiet. The sun dipped low, casting long, bruised shadows across the scrubland. Eli drove the team hard. His mind was miles away. He was doing the math in his head. Maggie could see it. He was weighing his pride against his survival. Maggie couldn't stay silent. She knew the trap. She knew the poison wrapped in that white paper. She turned on the wooden bench. She looked at Eli's rigid profile. "Mr. Harmon, you need to listen to me. What that man is doing in there is not charity. It is theft disguised as a legal contract. An economic system that allows wealthy men to exploit the desperation of the working class is fundamentally unjust. True power should never belong to the man who holds the purse strings. It belongs to the men who actually bleed into the soil. When corporations buy up the natural resources of the poor, they aren't offering a lifeline. They are building a cage. And we have a moral duty to recognize the bars before they lock the door." Eli pulled back on the reins. The wagon slowed. He looked at her, really looked at her. He didn't dismiss her words. He didn't tell her to mind the cooking. "I know it's a cage, Maggie," he said quietly. "But right now, the wolves are at the door, and a cage has walls." He clicked his tongue. The horses picked up the pace. Maggie sat back. The cold wind bit through her shawl. She watched the horizon. Warren Pruitt thought he was dealing with simple farmers. He thought he could wave a piece of paper and buy their lives. He didn't know Maggie Calloway was sitting in that wagon. He didn't know she had spent 2 decades learning how to break a cage. She would need ink, and she would need time. The house was quiet. The clock on the mantel ticked, a slow, steady rhythm. It was past midnight. The fire in the kitchen stove had burned down to glowing red embers. Coul was asleep. Eli sat at the heavy oak table. A single oil lamp burned between them. The crisp white contract from Warren Pruitt sat on the wood. It was 10 pages long, dense type, legal jargon designed to confuse and exhaust the reader. Eli rubbed his eyes. He looked defeated. A man used to fighting with his hands, now being strangled by paper. "It says I keep the land," Eli muttered. "It says I have access to the creek for domestic use. It sounds right. It sounds like a way out." Maggie stepped into the light. She had been standing in the shadows of the pantry. "May I see it, Eli?" she asked. Eli looked up. He was tired, too tired to argue. He slid the papers across the table. Maggie sat down. She pulled the lamp closer. She didn't just skim it. She read it the way a wolf reads a scent trail. Her eyes tracked line by line. She turned the pages. The silence in the kitchen stretched tight. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Finally, she set the paper down. She pressed her fingertips against the edge of the table. "You didn't learn to read like that in a country schoolhouse," Eli said softly. "No," Maggie said. She didn't look at him. She looked at the paper. "My ex-husband was a lawyer, a corrupt one. He drank most of his fees, so he couldn't afford a clerk. I spent 19 years drafting contracts. I copied property deeds. I read every precedent the territorial courts handed down. I know how men like him hide their knives." She tapped her finger on page 4, paragraph 3. "Here, clause section 7. It says you retain domestic access to the creek, but it references the Water Rights Act of 1870. Under that act, domestic use is limited to a single household well. It strictly excludes agricultural irrigation and cattle troughs. If you sign this, Warren Pruitt owns the water beneath your land. The moment you water your herd, you are stealing from his company. He will sue you, he will win, and the court will seize your land to pay the damages." Eli went perfectly still, the blood drained from his face. "He buys the water," Maggie said, her voice hard. "You keep the land, but your cattle die of thirst. Within 6 months, you'll be begging him to buy the dirt for pennies on the dollar. It's an eviction notice wrapped in a banknote." Eli stood up. The chair scraped loud against the floorboards. He walked to the window. He looked out into the pitch-black night. His hands were curled into tight fists. "My neighbors," he rasped. "Half the valley took his money today." "Then we have to stop them from cashing those checks," Maggie said. She stood up. "Tomorrow, we gather them here." The next morning, the Harmon Creek yard was full. Wagons pulled up. Horses stood restless. 15 men stood in the cold wind. These were Eli's neighbors. Good men. Tired men. They had come because Eli asked them to. They stood near the barn doors. Eli stood on the bed of an empty wagon. He held up his hand for quiet. "You all know me," Eli said. His voice carried over the wind. "I don't waste words, and I don't stir up trouble without cause. Yesterday, Warren Pruitt offered us a way out of the dark. I almost took it, but I was blind. We all were." He turned. He looked at Maggie, who stood on the porch. "I asked Mrs. Calloway to read the contract. She found the trap. I want you to listen to her. Listen close." The men turned. They frowned. This was 1878. Women didn't speak on business matters. Women didn't stand before crowds of men and give orders. A rancher named Miller spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Eli, we're drowning in debt. With respect, we don't need a housekeeper telling us how to handle men's business." Maggie didn't flinch. She didn't look down. She stepped off the porch. She walked straight into the middle of the crowd. She held Pruitt's contract in her hand. She looked Miller in the eye. Then she looked at the rest of them. She felt the old fear creeping up, the fear of being told to shut up, of being cast out. She pushed it down. She let her anger rise, a righteous, burning anger. Her voice rang out like a church bell, clear, unshakable. "You think the law is a mystery, gentlemen. You think because a man wears a silk vest and uses big words, he holds authority over you. You are wrong. The law is not a weapon meant only for the rich to bludgeon the poor. True justice is the great equalizer. It demands that every person, regardless of their wealth or station, has the right to be informed, the right to protect their livelihood, and the right to stand against exploitation. When you sign away your resources out of ignorance or fear, you aren't just losing your land. You are surrendering your fundamental human right to self-determination. Ignorance is the chain they use to bind you. Knowledge is the key to break it. The yard went silent. Not a man moved. Even Miller stopped chewing his tobacco. Maggie held up the paper. "If you cash those checks, Pruitt owns the water your cattle drink. He owns the water that feeds your crops. Under the Act of 1870, you will be trespassers on your own land. He isn't saving you. He is waiting for you to die of thirst." She tore the contract in half. The sound was loud in the quiet yard. She tore it again. She let the pieces flutter to the dirt. "I can show you the clauses," she said. Her voice dropped to a steady, rhythmic beat. "I will sit with every one of you. We will go through the deeds. We will file a collective injunction in Santa Fe. He is banking on the fact that you won't fight back together. He is banking on you dying alone." She stepped back. The men looked at the torn paper in the mud. They looked at Eli, then they looked at the woman who had just changed the entire landscape of their lives. Miller stepped forward. He reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out the folded contract he had signed yesterday. He didn't say a word. He just tore it in half. One by one, the other men did the same. Eli watched from the wagon. He looked at Maggie. The wind whipped her hair. Her shoulders were set straight. She wasn't just a housekeeper anymore. She wasn't returned freight. She was the fire that was going to save them all. December came down hard. It didn't sneak in. It hit the New Mexico territory like a hammer. The wind howled off the eastern ridges. It carried a blinding, stinging snow, the kind of snow that buried trails and froze cattle standing up. It was near midnight. Maggie lay in her narrow iron bed. The wool blankets were heavy, but the cold still found her bones. She couldn't sleep. The wind was too loud. It rattled the window panes. It shook the walls. Then she heard it. Underneath the roar of the wind, there was a sharp, panicked whinny. It came from the barn. Maggie sat up. She threw off the blankets. She didn't hesitate. She pulled her thick wool dress over her nightgown, shoved her bare feet into her leather boots, and grabbed her heavy shawl. She pushed her bedroom door open. The kitchen was freezing. She lit a kerosene lantern. She wrapped the shawl over her head and pushed the back door open. The snow blinded her. It felt like broken glass against her cheeks. She held the lantern high. She leaned into the wind and fought her way across the yard. The barn loomed ahead, a massive shadow in the whiteout. She grabbed the heavy iron latch. She pulled with all her weight. The door slid open just enough. She slipped inside. The wind cut off. The air in the barn was thick. It smelled of old hay, sweet molasses, and fresh blood. "Eli," Maggie called out. "Back here." His voice was ragged, tight with strain. Maggie hurried down the center aisle. She stopped at the last double stall. Eli was on his knees in the straw. His coat was off. His sleeves were rolled up past his elbows. His arms were slick with sweat and blood. Beside him lay Rosie, the prize dapple-gray mare. Rosie was thrashing. Her eyes were rolled back, showing the whites. Her breath came in harsh, rattling gasps. "She's been down for an hour," Eli said. He didn't look up. He kept his hands firmly on the mare's swelling flank. "The foal is turned. It's breeched. One leg is back. If I don't turn it, they both die." Maggie didn't faint. She didn't gasp. She set the lantern on a wooden barrel. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. Her voice was steady. Eli finally looked at her. He saw a woman in her nightclothes, shivering but standing tall. "I need you to hold her head," Eli said, "and keep her calm. If she rolls on me while my arm is inside her, she'll break my shoulder. You have to keep her grounded." Maggie climbed into the stall. She knelt in the blood and the muck. She didn't care about the dress. She reached out and took the mare's heavy, thrashing head into her lap. "Easy, girl," Maggie whispered. She stroked the soft velvet of Rosie's nose. "Easy now. We are right here." The work was brutal. It wasn't romantic. It was sheer, agonizing labor. Eli had to push the foal back into the birth canal to find the missing leg. The mare screamed. It was a terrible, human-sounding sound. Maggie bore her weight down on the horse's neck. Her muscles burned. Her back ached. "Got it," Eli grunted. The cords in his neck stood out. "Pulling! Now!" Maggie held on. 10 minutes passed. It felt like 10 years. With a final massive heave, the foal slid out onto the straw. It was a tangled, wet mass of limbs. It didn't move. The barn went dead silent, only the howling wind outside. Eli slumped back against the wooden slats. He was exhausted, beaten. Maggie didn't stop. She grabbed a handful of dry straw. She scrambled across the stall on her knees. She began rubbing the foal's chest, hard, vigorously. "Breathe," she commanded. She rubbed harder. "Come on, breathe." Eli watched her. He saw the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes, the same light he had seen when she tore up Warren Pruitt's contract. Suddenly the foal snorted, a wet, coughing sound. Its rib cage expanded. Then a weak, high-pitched whinny filled the air. Eli let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He closed his eyes. He leaned his head back against the wood. Maggie sat back on her heels. Her hands were trembling. Her apron was ruined. She looked at the tiny, shivering animal trying to lift its head. A slow, exhausted smile touched her lips. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just sat in the hay, catching their breath. The adrenaline slowly left their veins, leaving behind a deep, aching fatigue. Eli reached over. He picked up a clean rag. He handed it to Maggie. "Thank you," he said quietly. Maggie took the rag. She wiped her hands. "We didn't lose them." "No, we didn't." Eli pulled his knees up. He rested his forearms on them. He stared at the lantern light flickering against the barn wall. The silence between them felt different now. The walls were down. The bitter cold outside made the small, blood-stained stall feel like the only safe place in the world. "I was in this stall 6 years ago," Eli said. His voice was barely a whisper. Maggie stopped wiping her hands. She listened. She didn't interrupt. "Bee was sick," Eli continued. He didn't look at Maggie. He looked into the past. The cancer had spread. The doctor gave her laudanum for the pain. She was asleep in the house. A mare was foaling out here. I came out alone. The foal died. The mare died. I sat in this exact spot, and I knew. I knew I was going to lose everything I loved." He swallowed hard. It was a heavy sound. "I've been alone since then, Maggie, not just without a wife, but alone in the fight. I forgot what it was like to have someone pull the weight with me, and it terrifies me." Maggie watched the tough, hardened rancher strip away his armor. She saw the guilt in his eyes, the guilt of surviving, the guilt of moving on. She shifted closer. She didn't touch him, she just offered her presence. "You think if you let someone else in, you're replacing her," Maggie said softly. "You think moving forward is a betrayal." Eli finally looked at her. His gray eyes were shining in the lamplight. "How do I give someone a heart that already belongs to a ghost?" Maggie held his gaze. She didn't look away. She spoke with the absolute certainty of a woman who had spent a lifetime studying the human soul. "Loving someone new is never a burden to the past, Eli, nor is it a betrayal. When you love someone with all your soul, you don't carve out a piece of yourself and lose it forever. True compassion, true love, doesn't subtract. It multiplies. Your heart simply stretches wider to carry the memory of the dead alongside the hope of the living. To deny yourself the right to love again isn't honoring her memory. It is simply choosing to let grief win. And a life built only on grief is not a life. It is a monument to a grave." The words hung in the cold air. They were true. They were heavy. And they were exactly what Eli Harmon needed to hear. He reached out. His large, rough hand covered hers. He didn't say anything else. He didn't try to kiss her. This wasn't the time for romance. This was the foundation of something far stronger. It was the birth of profound, unshakable trust. They sat together in the hay, their hands joined, while the newborn foal took its very first trembling steps. By January, the snow had packed into hard, shining ice. The truce with winter had ended, and so had the truce with Warren Pruitt. It was a Sunday. Maggie and Eli rode the wagon into Cielo Rojo for church services. It was the one day a week the entire valley gathered. Coul rode his roan gelding alongside them. For the first time in months, the Harmon family looked whole. Maggie wore a dark blue wool coat. Her chin was up. She felt a quiet pride. She had helped save the valley's water. She had delivered a foal. She was finding her footing. She was starting to believe that the label of returned goods had finally been washed away. They hitched the wagon outside the white clapboard church. The bell was ringing. People were gathering on the wooden steps. But as they approached, the crowd went quiet. The friendly nods from last month were gone. Women looked away. Men stared at the ground. A cold, suffocating tension gripped the air. Eli slowed his step. He put a hand on Maggie's arm. Something is wrong. The church doors opened. Warren Pruitt walked out. He didn't look like a defeated man. He looked triumphant. In his right hand he held a piece of yellow paper, a telegraph wire. He stopped at the top of the stairs. He looked down at Eli. Then his eyes slid to Maggie. They were full of poison. "Morning, Eli," Warren said loudly. His voice carried across the frozen churchyard. "Bringing your housekeeper to the Lord's house? That's a charitable act, considering her history." Eli dropped his hand from Maggie's arm. He took a step forward. "Watch your mouth, Pruitt." Warren smiled. He held up the yellow paper. "I don't need to watch my mouth, Eli. The telegraph office does the talking for me. I sent a wire to Oklahoma, to the school board of the county where Mrs. Calloway used to teach." Maggie's breath caught. Her stomach plummeted. The ground beneath her felt like it was crumbling. She knew exactly what was on that paper. "Did you know," Warren addressed the crowd now, playing the concerned citizen, "that this woman was fired in disgrace? Terminated for moral turpitude. She was caught harboring a male vagrant in her home overnight, an unmarried woman, keeping a stray boy in her bedchamber, and she dares to stand among decent, God-fearing families?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. Whispers broke out like wildfire. In 1878, a woman's reputation was fragile glass. Once shattered, it could never be repaired. Maggie stood paralyzed. The faces around her blurred. They looked just like the faces of the school board members back in Oklahoma. The men who hadn't listened to the truth. The men who only cared about the rules. Eli stood frozen. He looked at Warren. Then he turned to Maggie. "Maggie," Eli said. His voice was tight, confused. "What is he talking about?" Maggie looked at Eli. She saw the shock in his eyes, and in that 1 second of hesitation, her trauma took over. She didn't see the man who had held her hand in the folding stall. She saw Frank Kessler handing her an envelope. She saw Dale Pruitt telling her she was too much trouble. She saw the inevitable end. "He doubts me." The thought screamed in her mind. "He needs me to prove it." She didn't cry. Her face went as hard as carved stone. She looked at Warren, then back at Eli. "It's true," Maggie said. Her voice was flat, lifeless. "I was fired." "For harboring a vagrant?" Eli asked. He wanted her to deny it. He desperately needed her to fight back. "Tell me the whole truth, Maggie." But Maggie's pride, the brittle, damaged pride of a woman who had been thrown away too many times, snapped shut like a steel trap. "The telegraph is accurate, Mr. Harmon," she said coldly. She took a step back from him, distancing herself. "I kept a boy in my house overnight without permission. The board fired me." She didn't tell him the boy was 14. She didn't tell him the boy's father had broken 3 of his ribs with a wagon spoke. She didn't tell him she had stayed awake all night, putting cold compresses on the child's bruised face, hiding him from a monster the town refused to arrest. She refused to beg for belief. She turned on her heel. She walked away from the church, away from the staring crowd, and headed straight down the dirt road toward the ranch. Eli started to go after her, but Coul grabbed his father's arm. "Let her go, Pa," Coul said bitterly. "Looks like Pruitt was right. She's just like the rest of them, keeping secrets." Eli stood in the frozen yard, staring at the telegram in Warren's hand. He felt completely betrayed. 3 hours later, Eli rode back to the ranch. The house was dead quiet. He walked into the kitchen. The stove was cold. He walked down the hall to Maggie's room. The door was open. Maggie was kneeling on the floor. Her battered leather trunk was open. She was folding her 2 spare dresses. Her face was an unreadable mask. Eli leaned against the doorframe. The anger in him was warring with a deep, hollow ache. "So you're just going to pack?" Eli asked. His voice was harsh. "You're going to let Pruitt win after everything we've done?" Maggie didn't stop folding. She placed a heavy wool sweater into the trunk. "I am saving you the trouble of calling the wagon, Eli," she said evenly. "I know how this works. I am returned goods. The moment the merchandise shows a flaw, the contract is void." "I asked you for the truth," Eli practically shouted. "I stood right there and gave you the floor. Why didn't you defend yourself?" Maggie stopped. She placed her hands on the edge of the trunk. She slowly stood up. She turned to face him. Her eyes were blazing, not with sadness, but with a furious, righteous indignation. "Because I shouldn't have to put my trauma on trial to earn my humanity. The fact that you demanded an explanation before you offered your protection is exactly what is wrong with this world. True respect is not conditional. It does not require a woman to bare her scars to a crowd of hypocrites to prove she is worthy of standing among them. If my months of honest labor, if my character, and if the blood we shed together in that barn were not enough to earn your absolute trust, then no explanation I give you now will ever be enough. I will not beg for the dignity I already possess." Eli felt the words hit him like a physical blow. He stepped back. The anger drained out of him, replaced by a sudden sickening realization. He hadn't protected her. When the wolves circled, he had stepped back and asked her to prove she wasn't meat. Maggie turned back to her trunk. She picked up her hairbrush. "The stagecoach comes through Cielo Rojo at 6 tomorrow morning," she said quietly. "I would appreciate a ride, if it's not too much trouble." Eli stood in the doorway. He looked at the woman he was about to lose. He looked at the leather trunk. He turned around and walked down the hall. He didn't say a word. The fracture was complete. The trust was broken. And in the silence of the cold farmhouse, Maggie closed her trunk, believing for the third time in her life that she was entirely alone. The stagecoach was due at 6. Maggie sat on the edge of her narrow iron bed. The room was dark. The house was entirely silent. Her battered leather trunk sat by the door. It was packed. The buckles were fastened. It was a familiar scene. Too familiar. She looked at the trunk. It looked like a tombstone. It marked the death of her pride, over and over again. Kessler, Pruitt, and now Harmon. She stood up. She walked over to the washstand and looked in the small, cracked mirror. The woman looking back was tired. There were lines around her eyes, dust in her hair. She looked exactly like a woman who was used to being told to leave. Something inside her snapped. It wasn't a loud break. It was a quiet, solid click, like the hammer of a rifle pulling back into place. She looked at the trunk again. No, she wasn't running. Not this time. She had done nothing wrong. She had saved a child's life. She had worked her fingers to the bone for this valley. She was not a piece of defective freight. Maggie didn't put on her traveling coat. She put on her heavy canvas work apron. She walked out of her room, past the cold kitchen stove, and out the front door. She didn't wait for Eli's wagon. She walked. The sun was just breaking over the eastern ridge. The frozen dirt crunched under her boots. 2 miles to Cielo Rojo. The cold bit at her cheeks, but she didn't feel it. She was burning from the inside out. She reached the town limits. The stagecoach was idling outside the depot. The driver tipped his hat to her, expecting her to board. Maggie walked right past it. She walked down the center of the dirt street. Men were stepping out of the mercantile. Women were sweeping their boardwalks. They stopped. They stared. Maggie didn't lower her eyes. She stopped in front of the Silver Dollar Saloon. In 1878, a respectable woman did not cross the threshold of a saloon. It was a place for gambling, whiskey, and men's business. To step inside was to ruin whatever reputation you had left. Maggie pushed the swinging wooden doors open. The smell of stale beer, sawdust, and cheap cigar smoke hit her. The piano player stopped mid-note. Men at the poker tables froze with their cards in the air. At the long mahogany bar stood Warren Pruitt. He was surrounded by a few of the town elders, the men who had whispered about her at the church. They were drinking morning coffee, laughing about the clever trick played on Eli Harmon. Warren turned. The smile slid off his face. "Mrs. Calloway," Warren said. His voice was laced with mock concern. "You must be lost. The stagecoach depot is down the road." Maggie walked straight toward him. Her boots sounded loud against the wooden floorboards. She didn't stop until she was 5 feet away. "I am exactly where I intend to be, Mr. Pruitt," Maggie said. Her voice didn't shake. The bartender wiped his hands on a rag. "Ma'am, you can't be in here. It ain't proper." "I am not here to be proper," Maggie said. She looked around the room. She looked at every man who had judged her. Then her eyes locked on Warren. "You stood in a house of God and called me a woman of loose morals. You used my past as a weapon to strip away my dignity and shame a good man. Yes, I was fired. I was fired because the polite, proper society of my hometown allowed a drunken coward to break his own child's ribs in the name of discipline. I took that boy into my home. I hid him from a monster. I would rather be branded immoral by a town of cowards than stand by and watch a child die. The right to protect the innocent is a higher law than any rule written in a schoolhouse. A society that punishes compassion while ignoring cruelty is a society built on rot, and I will not apologize for doing what was right." The saloon was dead silent. You could hear the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. Warren's face flushed red. He stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You arrogant, self-righteous—" The swinging doors crashed open. Eli Harmon stood in the doorway. He didn't look like a defeated farmer. He looked like the wild, untamed frontier. His long duster coat was swept back. His hand rested naturally, effortlessly, on the carved wooden grip of the Colt revolver on his hip. He walked into the room. He didn't look at Warren. He walked straight to Maggie. He stopped right beside her. His shoulder brushed against hers, a solid, immovable wall. Eli swept his cold gray eyes across the room. He looked at the town elders. He looked at Warren. "Does any man here," Eli said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, "have anything else to say about the character of my future wife?" Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Warren swallowed hard. He looked at Eli's eyes. He looked at the Colt. He took a step back, raising his hand slightly. "No offense meant, Eli, just stating facts." "You stated nothing but venom," Eli said. He turned to Maggie. He didn't care who was watching. He didn't care about the sawdust or the whiskey or the whispers. "I was a fool yesterday," Eli said to her. "I asked for an explanation when I should have offered my shield. I am asking you to come home." Maggie looked at him. The anger in her chest slowly gave way to something else, something warm, something permanent. She nodded once. They turned their backs on Warren Pruitt. They pushed through the swinging doors and walked out into the morning sun, side by side. Spring arrived in New Mexico like a slow apology. The bitter frost retreated. The dirt softened. Green shoots of buffalo grass pushed up through the thawing earth. The creek ran high and loud. At the Harmon Ranch, the tension had broken. The air in the house was lighter. Maggie still cooked. She still scrubbed. But she wasn't just working for wages anymore. She was working for her home. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Eli and Coul were out mending the western fence line. Maggie decided to tackle the attic above the kitchen. The air up there was thick with dust. Sunbeams cut through the small window, illuminating forgotten relics. Broken saddles, old tin plates. In the far corner, tucked beneath a heavy canvas tarp, Maggie found a box. It was made of aromatic cedar. The brass hinges were tarnished. It wasn't locked. Maggie knelt in the dust. She hesitated. She wiped her hands on her apron, slowly lifting the lid. Inside lay 3 leather-bound journals. The leather was worn soft from handling. Maggie opened the top one. The handwriting was elegant, loops and swoops of faded black ink. It was B. Harmon's diary. Maggie felt a sudden spike of guilt. She was intruding. She started to close the book, but a loose piece of paper fluttered out and landed on the floorboards. She picked it up. It was dated 6 years ago, just weeks before B had died. Maggie read the words. Her breath hitched in her throat. She read them again. She carefully folded the paper, placed it back in the box, and carried the cedar chest downstairs. When Eli came in from the fields at dusk, he was covered in dirt and sweat. He washed up at the pump, walking into the kitchen, drying his hands on a towel. He stopped. The cedar box sat in the center of the kitchen table. Eli stared at it. The towel went still in his hands. He looked at Maggie, who was standing by the stove. "I was cleaning the attic," Maggie said softly. I didn't read the journals, but a paper fell out. I couldn't help but see it. Eli walked slowly to the table. He didn't look angry. He just looked profoundly sad. He ran his calloused fingers over the smooth cedar wood. "I haven't opened this in 5 years," he murmured. "Eli," Maggie said, taking a step toward him. "Read the loose page, please." Eli opened the box. He found the folded paper. He opened it. His eyes moved across the page. Maggie watched his chest rise and fall. A long, shuddering breath escaped his lips. He looked up at her. He held the paper out. "Read it to me," he asked. His voice was thick. "I want to hear it out loud." Maggie took the paper. She stood in the fading light of the kitchen. Her voice was steady, gentle, and clear. "Eli, my hands are too weak to write much today. I know you are scared. I know you think that burying me means burying the best part of your life, but don't lock the door when I am gone. Your heart is too big, Eli. It is too big to weather the winter alone. Please, find a woman who knows how to honor your scars. Find someone to share the porch with. I love you enough to want you to be happy when I cannot be there to make you smile." Maggie lowered the paper. A single tear tracked through the dust on Eli's cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He walked over to the back door, opening it to the cool evening air. He stood on the porch, looking out at the dark silhouette of the barn. Maggie followed him. She didn't push. She just stood beside him in the twilight. "I thought I was keeping faith with her by staying alone," Eli said to the night. "I thought if I let someone else sit in her chair or sleep in this house, I was erasing her." He turned his head. He looked at Maggie. "I was wrong. I see that now. Loving you does not mean I'm replacing B. Human beings are not interchangeable parts in a machine. You are not filling an empty space, Maggie. You have built a brand new home for us all. True love doesn't erase what came before. It honors the past by proving that the heart is strong enough to keep expanding. You taught me that. You taught me that a life is measured by the courage it takes to keep opening the door, no matter how many times it gets slammed shut." He reached out. He took her hands. They were calloused. They were scarred. They were the most beautiful hands he had ever held. "I didn't open the wagon door for you that first day out of pity, Maggie," he whispered. "I opened it because I saw a brave woman standing in the frost, refusing to bow her head to a hard world. I want you to stay. Not as my housekeeper, not for wages, as my wife." Maggie looked up into his gray eyes. The fear was gone. The shadows were gone. "I'm not going anywhere, Eli," she said. He didn't kiss her right away. He just pulled her against his chest, wrapping his arms around her tightly, burying his face in her hair. They stood on the porch for a long time, listening to the creek run, holding on to the future. The wedding took place in May of 1879. There was no grand cathedral. There were no imported silk gowns or Eastern musicians. They didn't need them. They married beneath the massive ancient oak tree behind the farmhouse. The branches were heavy with new green leaves casting dappled sunlight over the grass. It was a small gathering, just the people who mattered. Roberto, the old ranch hand, stood proudly in a clean shirt. Doc Reeves, the town physician, stood leaning on his cane, a warm smile on his face. And standing right beside Eli, serving as his best man, was Coul. The boy had grown in the last 6 months. The bitterness had drained from his face. He wore a borrowed tweed suit that was slightly too large in the shoulders, but he stood tall. Earlier that morning, Coul had come out to the porch where Maggie was drinking her coffee. He hadn't called her the housekeeper. He had simply said, "You make him smile again." "Thank you, ma'am." The circuit preacher stood before them. He held a worn leather Bible. He spoke of endurance, of seasons turning, and of the harvest that comes after a long winter. Then it was time for the vows. Eli didn't have a piece of paper. He just held both of Maggie's hands in his. "I was a man dying of thirst," Eli said, his voice carrying over the quiet breeze. "Not just for water, but for hope. You came here with nothing but a trunk and a fierce spirit. You fought for this land. You fought for my son. You fought for me. I vow to spend the rest of my days making sure you never feel like you have to stand alone at a crossroads again. You are my home, Maggie." Maggie smiled. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. She didn't need a paper either. She knew exactly what she wanted to say. She looked at Eli, and she spoke words that were a testament to everything she had survived. "I spent a lifetime believing I was a piece of torn fabric meant to be cast aside. I let cruel men dictate my worth. But Eli, you taught me the greatest truth. Our value as human beings is not determined by the careless people who throw us away. It is measured by how fiercely we choose to love, respect, and shelter each other when the storms come. Dignity is not granted by society. It is claimed by the soul. You saw me when the world looked away. I choose to stay here, with you." Where the door was always open before I even knocked, the preacher smiled. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Eli leaned down and kissed her. It was gentle, deep, and full of a quiet, unshakable certainty. The small crowd clapped. Coul actually grinned. The afternoon drifted into a simple celebration with roasted beef, fresh bread, and the sweet sound of a fiddle played by one of the neighbors. Autumn, 1881. 2 years had passed since the wedding under the oak tree. The valley had changed. Warren Pruitt's syndicate had collapsed after Maggie helped organize the local ranchers. They had filed their injunction in Santa Fe, stood their ground, and the Eastern money had pulled out, looking for easier prey. Harmon Creek wasn't just surviving anymore. It was thriving. The afternoon sun was golden, casting long, warm shadows across the yard. Maggie stood on the front porch. She wiped her hands on a clean white apron. The ranch had grown, not just with cattle. Out by the old barn, a new, sturdy wooden building had been raised. It was a one-room schoolhouse. 3 days a week, children from the neighboring ranches, children who couldn't make the long trek into town, orphans and the sons and daughters of the ranch hands, came to Harmon Creek. Maggie taught them to read. She taught them history. But more importantly, she taught them how to think. Inside the parlor of the farmhouse, sitting in the corner near the stone hearth, was Maggie's old, battered leather trunk. It was no longer packed with spare dresses and fear. The lid was propped open. It was completely filled to the brim with books, slates, chalk. It was a treasure chest of knowledge for the children who sat on her rug every afternoon. The symbol of her repeated rejections had become the very foundation of her legacy. Eli rode into the yard on his big bay gelding. He tipped his hat back, swinging down from the saddle. He walked up the porch steps. He was covered in dust, smelling of horse sweat and leather, but his eyes were bright. He wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. They stood together, looking out over the pastures. In the distance, Coul was teaching a young orphaned boy how to hold a lasso. The boy laughed, a clear, ringing sound that echoed across the valley. "It's a good day," Eli murmured, kissing the side of her neck. "It is," Maggie agreed. She leaned back against the solid strength of her husband. She looked at the schoolhouse. She looked at the trunk full of books visible through the parlor window. She had been returned twice, cast out into the cold, told she was useless, damaged, unwanted goods, but out here, in the harsh, beautiful frontier of New Mexico, she had found a man who didn't look for perfection. He looked for a partner. They had built a life not out of convenience, but out of profound, chosen love. And looking out at the golden horizon, Maggie Harmon knew with absolute certainty that she would never have to pack that trunk again. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.
As the sun sets over the quiet valley and the dust settles on a land that has known both cruelty and grace, we are left with more than just the story of Maggie and Eli. We are left with a truth that cuts deeper than any frontier hardship. This story reminds us that a person's worth is never determined by how others treat them, but by the strength with which they choose to stand back up after being cast aside. Maggie was called returned goods and dismissed and devalued by a society that measured women by obedience and silence. Yet she carried within her something no man could take away: her dignity,
her voice, and her unwavering belief that she deserved to be treated as a human being. And in the end, it was not the world that changed her. It was her courage that changed the world around her. Through Eli, we are reminded that true strength is not found in dominance or control, but in respect, humility, and the willingness to learn. He did not save Maggie. He stood beside her, and in doing so, he became a better man. Their relationship teaches us that love is not about possession or perfection. It is about partnership, about choosing each other every single day, even when the past casts long shadows. And perhaps one of the most powerful lessons lies in the way Maggie used her knowledge not just to protect herself, but to uplift an entire community. She proved that education, awareness, and courage are the tools that break chains, especially the invisible ones built from fear and ignorance. This story also speaks to something deeply human: the need for compassion in a world that often rewards cruelty. From the boys she once protected to the ranchers she helped save, Maggie's actions remind us that doing what is right is not always easy, and it is rarely rewarded immediately. But it matters. It always matters. Because every act of kindness, every stand against injustice becomes a seed planted in the lives of others. In the end, the greatest message this story leaves us with is simple, yet powerful. You are not what the world calls you in your lowest moment. You are what you choose to become after it. No matter how many times life forces you to stand alone at a crossroads, there is always a path forward. One built not on fear, but on courage, dignity, and the quiet strength of the human spirit.